FutureSense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nyck Jeanes and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, FutureSense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is FutureSense. Yeah, good morning to you here. Tuned to Bay FM 999. You're now tuned to FutureSense here with myself, Nyck Jeanes, and Steve McDonald. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Nick. Here we are again.
Here we are again after being down in Melbourne last week, both of us.
Yeah, thankfully we made it back.
We did make it back.
Love Melbourne, though. It's a great place
Melbourne's
to
an
visit.
awesome city.
Yeah.
It's a bit like the Matrix on one hand. The next minute it feels like it's a really advanced city.
Well, it is, you know. There's lots of amazing stuff, progressive stuff going on in Melbourne. I always love visiting and just catching up with what's going on down there.
Absolutely.
You know, if I got to go to a city, then I love Melbourne as a city.
That's right, me too. You lived there for a while, didn't you?
I did. 7 years I was there.
Yeah. We're going to be talking a little bit about our journey down in Melbourne shortly. We were there, both of us, for the launch of Mind Medicine Australia with Professor David Nutt, who's the Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College London.
Congratulations on saying that so early in the morning.
Neuropsychopharmacology. That's a lovely word. It's one of those, like a German word, isn't it? It's got 27 syllables or more.
I think the MC on the evening said it was a bit like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
Yeah, exactly right. That's very good. You're tuned to FutureSense with Nyck Jeanes and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up. You're now tuned to FutureSense with Steve McDonald and myself, Nyck Jeanes. You may have already woken up this morning to the news that the coalition, federal coalition, has sort of caught up pretty much with Labor in striking distance, as they like to say, probably based on the fear generated largely by the Medivac legislation passing and defeating the coalition government on the floor of the House. First time it's happened, I think, in 90 years or something like that. And of course, the fear is out there now about being flooded by boat people. And that fear is, I guess, part of the structure of our times in terms of how many of us seem to respond to life, the universe, and everything. And one could argue it's indicative of a sort of mental conditions and mental illness in people. Not that fear is unnatural, fear is present, and everybody has some fear, of course. But we were recently, I'm just making a bit of a segue here, to our journey down to Melbourne to the launch of Mind Medicine Australia, which you'll find at mindmedicineaustralia.org, that's the website. And it's entitled A New Paradigm for Mental Health. This was a very serious and professional opening of something extremely important here in Australia.
It was a wonderful convergence of people from different walks of life, and it's a very important time here in Australia for psychedelic research. Our non-profit research organisation, Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, or PRISM for short, was formed in 2011 with considerable assistance and influence from Rick Doblin, the founder of the United States non-profit organisation MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And Rick came out here in 2010 and spoke at a conference and offered some lovely US dollars to help us get something happening here in Australia research-wise. And it was just a modest amount, but it was enough to help us get motivated and get organised and create our own research organisation. And then since then, I'm a co-founder of PRISM, as you know, Nick, and we've been knocking on doors for 7 or 8 years trying to find an institution that will help us start a psychedelic clinical trial here in Australia. And it was only in late 2017 that the doors started to open. And so it is a very interesting time. We had Office of Funding and also a couple of institutions, that one of which actually approached us, which was, of course, St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne, asking for assistance to get a psilocybin study up and running. And in a relatively short space of time, we've got that organised in St Vincent's, and their staff are very much leading the way on that, and PRISM's in a advisory role, but also a collaborative role in that. Our president, Dr. Martin Williams, is co-principal investigator for the psilocybin study, which is in their palliative care unit there, giving a spiritual experience essentially to terminally ill people to help take away their anxiety about dying. And so on the foundation of that progress, some discussions about furthering the cause here in Australia led to this idea of creating another non-profit organisation which could be a leader in terms of advocating psychedelic medicine and possibly expand into other areas, certainly including sponsoring research and also perhaps organising training of therapists sometime in the future. And that's how Mind Medicine Australia came about. And of course, what we were doing in Melbourne was attending the launch event, the public launch event, and we were very lucky to have David Nutt in the country at the time.
And what a wonderful name, David Nutt, with two T's, N-U-T-T, David Nutt, but a wonderful professor, as I said, professor of neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial College London. As he was hastened to pointed out, the amount of research now being done by some of the top universities in the world, including Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, New York University, Johns Hopkins, and many others in Europe and other countries. And we've been, as you said, a long way behind, and finally St Vincent's Hospital is going to do some serious research into one of these psychedelic substances in this way. But the focus was really on mental illness. 15% of the world's population, that's 1.1 billion people, currently have a mental illness. In Australia, mental illness is the leading cause of non-fatal disease burden and the third leading cause of total disease burden. And of course, it would seem to be getting worse. And if you particularly look at disadvantaged communities, Indigenous communities in particular, for example, the state of mental illness is far worse with that epigenetic shit coming down the generations on people. And so it is time for a really big reassessment of how we treat these sort of illnesses and diseases in the world.
Yeah, we've got a lot of catching up to do here in Australia, and thanks to amazing organisations like MAPS and also like the Hefter Research Institute, who have funded the psilocybin studies that have been done overseas, we're able to stand on the shoulders of giants, as they say, and we don't have to start from scratch ourselves. So we're very grateful for that.
And it was great that we at the launch there was about 500 people, I think, in a rather large theatre space at Melbourne University. This was a serious piece of work, a serious launch with serious people, and I say that in the sense that there were a lot of professors, doctors, a lot of mental health professionals there, as well as obviously a lot of very interested people in the field of this new medicine, of the new psychedelic research in one way or the other that's going on everywhere in the world. Yeah,
it was a wonderful convergence. There was a strong representation, of course, from the psychedelic community and from the science community, as you said. Medical people. I sat next to a wonderful lady from St Vincent's Hospital, and also philanthropists. And it's the first time I've ever been to a psychedelically oriented event in Australia where there were philanthropists in the audience, and that's amazing.
In fact, the two principals of Mind Medicine Australia are Peter Hunt and Tanya de Jong. Peter Hunt is an investment banker, and the two of them apparently put in the sort of seed first $1 million. So pretty amazing to see an investment banker who's clearly had some sort of awakening or simply looked at the research and go, this is valuable, this is important.
He's quite open about it, both of them are. In fact, they spoke about it at the launch event, that they had some experiences with psilocybin themselves, which were life-changing and really spurred them on to do something about it, about making it available.
Indeed. And Professor Nutt's Professor Nutt's presentation is that the initial part of that was about the history of psychedelics. And most of us who are somewhat familiar with this area of endeavour would be familiar with that, but it was important I think for me to remember that in a sense the psychedelic revolution was closed down in the late 60s, early 70s by the Nixon administration and following around the world and all Western democracies because essentially of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, it was absolutely political, not scientific, and this has left us with this legacy of drug laws which are based on the political opinions of that era and not based on science. And David Nutt has been an absolute pioneer in terms of researching and providing hard data around the harms of those of illicit drugs versus legal drugs. And he's shown very, very clearly through his work that some of the drugs which are legal, such as particularly alcohol and tobacco, are amongst the most harmful drugs in terms of their harm to the user and their harm to wider society. And some of the drugs that are classed as the most harmful on our highest drug schedules, which in Australia that is Schedule 9, overseas in places like the US they call it Schedule 1. We've got things like psilocybin, like MDMA, which actually in David Nutt's study show up as being the least harmful and far, far less harmful than even horse riding, as he famously announced in the US.
Got into a bit of trouble saying that, didn't
trouble for saying that, yes.
Well, we've also, and in complementary news just this week, Israel's health ministry has approved compassionate use of MDMA to treat PTSD. They've sort of jumped the queue a little bit, but based in the research that you're referring to there, particularly the research by MAPS and Rick Doblin and co. in America, where the Israeli health ministry sent a representative for training in the US and to work on a confidential basis through the California-based multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Can't say that word, I can say neuropsychopharmacology, MAPS. And so that's pretty amazing. And of course, Israel is arguably one of the most countries with a huge degree of PTSD for fairly obvious reasons.
Yeah, obviously that region there is an important one globally in terms of addressing some of the basic challenges of mental illness and humanity in general. And of course, Israel is really following on the tails of the US, where the US FDA, Federal Drug Administration, which is the equivalent of our Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration, have declared MDMA-based or MDMA-assisted therapy as a breakthrough therapy,
yes,
based on the results of the phase 2.
And just explain what breakthrough, it's kind of obvious, but just explain what that means, because it sort of jumps the queue a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, what it means in practical sense is that it is a way of accelerating the availability of this medicine to the general public. And so normally in the drug development process, you've got to complete phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 drug trials before something can be classified a prescription medicine and made available. And so MAPS has recently finished their phase 2 studies and they're about to, and just beginning phase 3 right now. And breakthrough therapy status given by the FDA allows them to make the medicine available to the general public during the phase 3 trials, which is an extraordinary thing. And Rick Doblin from MAPS has said very clearly that they plan this year to start licensing clinics in the USA where the general public will be able to go and pay for treatment via MDMA-assisted psychotherapy with licensed practitioners who are overseen by MAPS. So that's an extraordinary thing. And essentially Israel has just declared the same thing, that they're going to make this compassionately available to people who need it before the studies are finished.
Yeah, pretty amazing stuff.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking FutureSense here on Bay FM.
9:31 here on FutureSense on Bay FM with Nick and Steve. We were talking about the My Medicine Australia launch and the new psychedelic revolution and the windows of opportunity that provides. And another piece of news this week, Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper signed a law that will now allow school nurses to administer medical marijuana to students, the Denver Post reports. But that doesn't mean that the kindergarteners are going to start ripping bowls in the nurse's office. The law only applies to cannabis oil and other non-smokable marijuana like CBD oil, and requires that students have a medical marijuana card and written permission from their parents and school principal.
I guess it's like a fast track to high school, right?
Oh dear.
Very interesting. And of course,
after that there's university.
That's right.
The university.
Very expansive education.
Oh dear.
And of course, when we talk about the change process and the development of human consciousness and our evolution, altered states play a very important role. And this is the key link with psychedelic medicines, is understanding how these things can be useful, because we've grown up in a society where the use of most altered state substances has been suppressed for a long, long time. Some people would say, the last 2,000 years or so, with the rise of Christianity and other structured religions. We're in a place where we need to relearn how to use altered states in a constructive and measured and healthy way.
Yes.
Because certainly during my lifetime, the general use of altered state substances like alcohol has been almost the opposite, destructive and detrimental in some ways.
And why do you think that is? I mean, there's good reason in terms of, because we're moving here, folks, towards a bit of an expose this morning of Claire W. Graves' second tier part of his model, and particularly layer 7, or the yellow layers it's also called, and why some of the factors in society and culture are present right now in terms of what they're showing us about where we may be moving to, or what it's offering to us.
That's right, and the researcher whose work we draw from so often on this show, Dr. Claire W. Graves, he wrote that each particular value system in this spiral model that he put together tends to prefer certain types of drugs. And he also wrote that whenever society is going through change, considerable change, then the use of drugs increases, the prevalence increases. And the reasons are that if you look at the process of moving through change, what it feels like, what we experience when we move through change, our perspective on the world comes to a point where it's no longer useful for solving the most severe challenges that we face. And so we sort of hit a bit of a brick wall momentarily, and the first response to that is what we call a regressive values search, where we look back into our past and we remember a time when things used to work okay, and then we go back and revisit those old value sets to see whether they'll work in this position we find ourselves in. And the whole world is really going through this particular phase of the change process right now, where we're seeing our leaders saying we need to get back to the old values, we need to go back to the old ways in order to solve our problems. And what that does effectively is it actually speeds up our progress through change, because the old ways are even less appropriate for solving our new problems than our current values are. And so that creates a larger gap, a more evolutionary tension, which actually drives us to move forward through the change process. And when we move through that change process, one of the critical factors is being able to see different perspectives on life and being able to get insights into new ways of doing things. And the very best way of doing that is through altered states of consciousness. Yeah.
Which may, of course, appear, we're not advocating in any sense of drug taking, but the judicious and carefully administered setting, as we used to say back in the day, of medicine application in the kind of way we're talking about, and My Medicine's talking about with these trials, and the trial in Israel that's also going on. But also that we still hang on to our old substances, alcohol, tobacco, and the like, in that regressive moment. And I guess my question before was, like, why are we doing that now? Still, even more so, because there's a lot of defence of those old industries. And of course, money's the obvious thing there, yes, but it's more than that, isn't it, somewhere?
Well,
somehow?
Yeah, from a values point of view, layer 4, which is what mainstream society is regressing to largely at the moment, which is an absolutistic way of dealing with the world, where you live by a rigid value set and look for right or wrong. It's just two choices. Yeah. And we look to higher authorities to lay down the rules around what's right or wrong. Okay, so one of the things that Graves wrote is that particular values system, layer 4, prefers alcohol. Of course, it's a communal value system and therefore has a long-term outlook on life. You have to work hard for 40 years before you get the gold watch. You have to live your entire life as a good person in God's eyes in order to get to heaven, right? There's no immediate reward in layer 4. And so to dull that sense of expectation, longing for an immediate result, alcohol is the perfect choice.
And of course it's embedded in some of those religions, not in Islam as I understand, but certainly in Judaism and Christianity. It becomes a ritualistic substance, the blood of Christ and the like. So it's not only just that social factor, but it's actually embedded in that.
That's right.
Layer 4's
drink this, all of you, and forget your immediate needs. Sacrifice yourself.
Folks, by the way, you can text in 043734 1119, 043734 1119, and comment or ask questions or make any statements you'd like, and we may or may not refer to them.
And just as a final segue, if you look at that study, which we're just getting involved with St Vincent's Hospital's palliative care unit in Melbourne. That study is all about transition through change, and it just happens to be perhaps the biggest transition that we make as human beings, and that is the transition beyond life on Earth. And so that intervention is providing an altered state to provide people insights as to what lies on the other side of that veil between the physical world and the afterlife.
And of course, what I was getting to the other day, the moment I lost track for a moment, is of course there are other ways of doing that, and many people focus on meditation and other sorts of practice, which can certainly be valuable and do exactly the same thing.
Absolutely, there are many different ways to get into altered states, and it's very much a horses for courses kind of a situation. You know, some people, if we talk about sport or physical exercise, some people like golf, some people like yoga, some people like football, and it's whatever suits you and your particular makeup is what's going to work best for you.
So we're going to talk first about the drivers between layer 6 and layer 7, the second tier, yeah?
Yeah, so this show is focused on the transition from what is known as first tier consciousness, which is the first 6 layers, which we're often talking about in our show here, FutureSense, to what's known as the second tier of consciousness. And this is really the headline of the whole story around human development, human evolution, in the work of Clare W. Graves, is this massive change that takes place between layer 6 and layer 7. And Clare Graves himself called it a momentous leap. And I'm just going to read a couple of quotes from Clare Graves about this particular transition. He said, quote, "It's the most difficult but at the same time the most exciting transition the human race has faced to date. It is not merely a transition to a new level of existence, but the start of a new movement in the symphony of human history."
Nice.
Amazing words there from Clare W. Graves.
Very beautiful.
And so there really is no precedent for this transition. And at the moment, the whole world is going through a transition, and in terms of the mainstream paradigm, the dominant paradigm, which has been in place for about 300 years now, the scientific industrial paradigm, what most of the world is transitioning to is not this second tier consciousness, but it's the final layer, layer 6 in the first tier, which is a humanistic, very values-centered, network-centric perspective and way of living life, way of being human.
Level playing field, egalitarianism, sustainability, renewability.
Yeah, exactly.
Acknowledgement of differences and diversity.
So we're pushing a little bit further into the future to talk about this big leap, momentous leap, as Clare Graves called it, into second tier consciousness. But we also should remember that when Clare did his research and he gathered his data mostly during the 1950s, he found a small percentage of people who were living life according to second tier consciousness.
Yes, 7 out of 1,065 or so.
Well, no, actually it was layer 8 that he found 6 people out of 1,065.
Okay.
So I don't have a solid figure on the number of people that he found at layer 7.
Because it sort of befuddled him at the time because he was situated in that era, wasn't it? So he discovered these things that didn't fit into the first tier parameters and went, well, this is describing something else.
Yeah, that's right. So at the time that he was doing his study, all of the models of human developmental psychology that existed at the time had no more than 7 stages in it, and of course Maslow's was probably one of the most famous staged model at the time, and so he in his initial study picked up those 7 different sets of human values. However, the people who were at the most complex of those sets changed over time, and his field study ran for 9 years. And so he not only gathered data on people, but he also gathered data on how people changed during those 9 years. And some of the people who showed up at layer 7 changed to what eventually was categorized as layer 8. And that put his model outside the box, in terms of everything that existed at the time around the understanding of how humans develop, how we mature.
Because you mentioned Abraham Maslow, of course, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and they were contemporaries, they were friends also, but Maslow said that Graves' model was far superior to his. And as we've said before in the show, Graves unfortunately died before his full oeuvre of work could be revealed and for him to actually speak to it and develop it, I guess.
That's right. So he passed away before publishing it academically, and was working very hard on that for many years before his death. But it was his final model, his hypothesis was never published in a peer-reviewed journal, and so consequently it didn't get academic recognition. And all of the study that I've done on Clare Graves' work has been outside of academic institutions for that reason. Yeah,
it's fascinating to me too that's the life story of Graves in this work. And in a sense, the work was perhaps too early. Was obviously ahead of its time in some way, and probably wouldn't have been received even anywhere near as much as it's beginning to be received now.
No,
at that time.
And this is typically the case. The way that change happens is it comes in waves, and it starts with a small percentage of people, and then slowly spreads out across the population. And so the pathfinders of these higher levels of consciousness were often very isolated and lonely people in terms of their understanding the world. There weren't too many others that they could share it with. And some of the early examples of second-tier consciousness that showed up in society were things like the theory of quantum mechanics, for example, which is roughly about 100 years old.
Yes.
So, even well before Graves was gathering his data, somebody was thinking in a second-tier way to come up with these ideas.
Well, I guess all of Einstein's work, you could arguably put into that.
Not all of his work, no. So if we look at his early work, like his theory of relativity, for example, it's layer 6 thinking, because it's network-centric. It's about relativity, right? It's literally relativity. But certainly his later work was an example of second-tier layer 7 thinking, yes. But isn't that interesting in itself? I mean, here's a man, Einstein, who's been held up as the archetypal genius, within the human race, and with some of his most celebrated work, the earlier stuff, it was layer 6. Yeah.
But I guess at that time there weren't that many expressions of layer 6 on the planet,
no,
so it
that's
would have
right.
looked quite extraordinary
so he was
and futuristic.
way ahead of the mainstream. Way ahead of the mainstream.
And when we speak of these, this is just a model. This is me speaking here. Steve perhaps has a different view, but this is just a model, and we certainly acknowledge that. And there is definitely, and there was not in Graves' work, a judgment about layers. It's what actually works for you or for a collective of human beings on this planet in a particular life condition frame that exists. If it works for you, whoever you are, whatever you express in these layers, is absolutely fine. However, we are now in a global situation where global challenges are so imperative, they're so big and so complex, that we really do perhaps arguably need a completely different frame in which to operate from to solve a lot of these challenges on the planet.
Yeah, and really essentially what Graves' work is doing is taking a kind of empty witnessing perspective on human evolution, and at a personal level we call that human development. And he's stepping outside of the value sets as best he can, and that's best done from a second-tier perspective, which I'm sure Graves had. And then you can look at the different value sets that come with each of these layers or stages in the progression, and each value set will be attracted to some things but will reject other things.
Yes.
So this rejection factor that you're talking about is characteristic of certain value sets, and certain value sets will reject certain things. And layer 6 in particular is very focused on rebalancing the imbalance in society, and consequently likes to try and make sure that everybody has equal access to everything and equal consideration, and is not judged and put aside, because one of the characteristics of layer 5 has been this separation between the 1% and the 99%, the successful and the unsuccessful. And that's something that layer 6 sees it has to rectify. Yeah.
Absolutely.
You're resonating right now on FutureSense with Steve McDonald and Nyck Jeanes.
Yeah, so let's launch deeper into the momentous leap.
Yeah, so just following on the back of what you said before about not judging people, there are a couple of aspects of Clare Graves' theory which I think are really, really important to understand before we do this deep dive. The first one is that each layer of consciousness that he identified in his model is perfectly adapted to coping with a particular set of life conditions. And the key thing that changes or is different between the sets of life conditions the layers live according to is the complexity. So at layer 1, they are relatively simple life conditions, and as you go up the layers, the complexity increases. Now, it's not a way of kind of hierarchically arranging people into good or bad, because if let's for example take somebody who's living life according to layer 5 as their psychological and operating system, if you took them out of the life conditions that fit with the modern scientific industrial world and put them into the life conditions at layer 1 or 2, they may not survive simply because they don't have the coping capacity that's suited to those particular conditions.
You don't have air conditioning or something.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. So it's important to understand that for a given set of life conditions, the matching operating system, we call it the layer, is the most adapted way of being human in those conditions. Okay, so it's not a value judgment in terms of good or bad.
Yes.
The other important thing to understand is that it's not about intelligence. So when Clare Graves did his study, he ran an intelligence test, and in his time, there was really only one kind of linear idea of intelligence, and that was logical, rational intelligence, which was known as IQ.
IQ tests.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so he ran a test like that, and he found that across the different value sets that corresponded with different layers, and he particularly at the time was aware of and was testing people who showed up as living from layer 6, 5, 4, and let me have a look at the diagram here. Actually, 4, 5, 6, and 7 were the. I'm just looking at the actual data from the book about Clare Graves' work, and it's a great book, by the way. Let me mention it. It's called Clare W. Graves: His Life and His Work, published by Rainer Crum and Benedict Pastorfer, and we'll tweet the details about that book. It was only published last year. Very, very lovely summary of Clare Graves' life and his work, and quite readable too.
Quite readable. It's only a couple hundred pages, if that.
It's only a small book that summarises it well. And so in there, it's got some graphs from his work displaying data about an intelligence assessment that he ran on people, and across those layers, what did I say? It was 4, 5, 6, and 7. He found there was almost no difference in intelligence. So even though somebody was living life in a more complex way and had their consciousness had adapted to match the coping capacity required by the complexity of their life conditions, it wasn't an increase in logical, rational intelligence. It was something else. I guess you might call it adaptive intelligence that was at play.
Yeah. Would you go so far as to use the word consciousness in some sense?
Well, I often do. I often do. I mean, consciousness is a very broad word.
And it's a bit of a troubled word still.
Sometimes I give disclaimers about that. Because consciousness can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. But, I use it as an umbrella term to try and capture the whole operating system, both conscious and subconscious. Which drives our behaviour, whatever it is that's driving our behaviour, the emergence of our values, our choices, our way of being human in a sort of an umbrella sense, an overall sense.
Yeah.
So as we launch into this talk about second-tier consciousness, and we're going to start with just looking at the transition factors which are driving the change beyond layer 6, I do want to point out also that in my humble opinion, there is widespread misunderstanding of second-tier consciousness and what the experience of living at second-tier consciousness is like and what the characteristics of it are. And this widespread misunderstanding, and particularly within the spiral dynamics community and also within the integral community, which is following Ken Wilber's integral theory work, the misunderstanding has come from a problem with the early assessment tools. So years ago, when the spiral dynamics movement was still growing, it developed some assessment tools which basically was a self-reporting questionnaire asking you about your values and asking you to choose from a multiple choice set, which of these values are you most attracted to. And then as a result of that questionnaire, it would then say, okay, here is your spread across the value systems. And we usually say that it's generally accepted that people live their life roughly around 3 of these layers at once. There's usually one layer which is your dominant layer, which drives most of your values and behaviour. There's a layer that you've still got one foot in that you're sort of leaving behind, and another layer on the other side which you're just starting to move into, and that's a general kind of a very broad brush description of what humans usually do or where they're usually at. The other thing is that these these value systems are layered, and that's why we call them layers. Traditionally they were called stages, but I've sort of gone to calling them layers because I think it's much more appropriate, because they're nested inside each other. So they're not discrete things where we leave one behind and move to the next one. They are like the layers of skin on an onion, where the next system is wrapped over the previous system. So if you're at layer 6, you've got layers 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 inside you, and you have access to operating from those layers if your life conditions determine that that's appropriate. And
transcend and include is the phrase.
That's right. So we transcend one layer, or we transcend to the next layer and include all the previous layers. Yeah, thank you, Nyck. And it's important, therefore, to also understand that if you're living life with layer 6 as your dominant operating system, then you, and this is an unconscious process, it's not something that we do by choice, you may switch to operate from layer 1 or layer 2 or layer 3 sometimes. So even outside that sort of 3-layer bracket, which is your main area of operation, you can still spiral down to previous layers, everything that you've got inside your particular set, when life conditions demand. So, often if we find ourselves around little kids, we'll spiral down and we'll be operating from layer 2, for example, to try and match where they're at. If we're faced with a real survival situation where we're genuinely concerned that we might not survive in a threatening situation, then we might spiral down to layer 1 and operate from there. But that, in the first tier of consciousness, so that's layers 1 through 6, that is an unconscious process. We're not aware that we're doing it. It's only when we make the transition into second tier that awareness arises. But just back to this widespread misunderstanding. So the misunderstanding came from the assessment tools, and the problem with the assessment tools was that if a person was addressing the questions from a base of layer 6, then the layer 8 questions, or the layer 8 responses, looked extremely attractive. Like, it's, that's me, or that's what I want to be like. And so what happened was a whole bunch of people who were living life according to layer 6 as an operating system ended up being told by the outcome of these assessment reports that they were at layer 8. And so that what that did was it skewed the understanding of second tier consciousness for a large part of the spiral dynamics community, and also, I'm sure, with overflow into the integral community as well, because there's a lot of crossover there. Ken Wilber based one of his books, at least, almost entirely on Claire Graves' model, which was boomeritis, talking about layer 6. And so I'm really aware that this could be troubling for a lot of people to hear, and even disturbing. But I'm just offering it as my observation, my humble opinion, and I invite you to dive into Claire Graves' work more deeply and investigate the issue yourself. There's a very popular book circulating at the moment called Reinventing Organizations by a author called Frederick Laloux. And
Laloux, yes.
It quite famously talks about creating a teal organization, and teal is the color that the integral movement, Ken Wilber, has given to the spiral dynamics yellow, or layer 7, which is the first step into second tier consciousness. And because of this general misunderstanding about the characteristics of second tier, then Laloux himself has written a book which he thinks is about creating a second tier organization, and most of, if not all of the people who are reading the book probably have the same impression. However, if you look at the book, the book is essentially about transitioning organizations out of layer 5 and into layer 6. It takes a network-centric systems approach to work, and it's talking about flattening hierarchies in organizations, moving to an equal access network-centric kind of interaction in the workplace with greater self-awareness, and all of those things are layer 6 characteristics. It lacks the multidimensionality that you would find if it was truly written for and from second tier consciousness.
I guess it occurs to me the metaphor of a 2-dimensional versus a 3-dimensional chess game.
Yeah, exactly. It's layer 6 is a very level playing field kind of perspective, so it tends to be flat in that respect. Let me say, though, that Laloux's book is a wonderful book. It's very well written for that transition from layer 5 to layer 6, so I'm not criticising the book in any way.
And which is extremely important at this time, because we're seeing the passing away slowly but surely, but faster than perhaps we even imagined or hoped for, of layer 5, of the industrial, consumerist, competitive, capitalist mind frame that has been dominating the earth for so long and caused both created amazing and wonderful things through science and technology and reductionism, and created a whole raft of new issues and problems on the planet which require a different layer, a different level of thinking
That's
to
right.
cope
So
with.
it's definitely what's next and what's appropriate for right now. It's a leading edge book in that sense.
But you say and on this program we say in our humble opinion that it's going to be a fairly short transition through layer 6 on the planet to a much bigger leap, the momentous leap that Graves articulated, because that's actually what is necessary on a global level to solve the issues and challenges that we have in front of us.
Yeah, that's right. So, and the other, just before I get off that misunderstanding topic, the other thing that I have seen is in reading Ken Wilber's work, there is confusion about that transition into second tier and what that looks like. And I think because Ken Wilber, what he's done in his work is he's brought together a wide range of research and integrated it in the most amazing way. And I'm deeply grateful for his work, and it's been a very important part of my own development is using his integral theory, which I still use every day. However, for example, the written work of Susan Cook-Greuter, who has put forward developmental psychology models, classifies the layers or stages differently than Graves did. So if you think about a temperature scale where you've got a Fahrenheit measurement and a Celsius measurement, and those don't exactly correspond to each other. You can't say that it's 3 degrees Celsius is 3 degrees Fahrenheit. It's just not. It doesn't. They don't even fit together if you try and put them on a linear scale. So we're talking about a different way of classifying, and Susan Cook-Greuter has used that different way, and she's placed one of her stages in the transition space between green and yellow on Graves's model, and that I think has created some confusion, and even might I dare to say in Ken Wilber's mind, as he's tried to encompass all of the perspectives of all of the researchers, it's ended up being rather muddy, and it's kind of contributed to this misunderstanding about the clear distinction of second tier consciousness, which I've seen described by Graves. So moving to the transition from 6 into 7, what is it that drives that? And I want to draw on Graves's words exactly here. Let me read from his book, and this is out of the book The Never-Ending Quest, which was published by Christopher Cowan and Natasha Todorowicz in 2005.
Fabulous book, but it's 600 odd pages, so
it is. And
refer to the little new one that Steve mentioned before.
This one's a collection of research notes, so it's not all that readable. But Graves said, picture, if you will, FS, which is his code for layer 6, man seated in a yoga position, contemplating his inner self. He has completed the last theme of the subsistence movement of existence. He's talking about first tier consciousness there. There are no new deficiency motivations to rouse him from his meditations. And there he's referring to the fact that each one of the first 6 layers has a particular deficiency which plays out as compulsive behavior that has to try and fill, this hole of. And so by completing 6, he's actually filled himself up, and he no longer is driven by compulsive behavior. Back to Graves. In fact, he might well go on contemplating his navel to the day of his death if he only had some suitable arrangement to care for his daily needs. And it's quite possible for a few layer 6 individuals to live this way. We know a few of them, don't we, Nick?
We do.
But what happens when the majority of the population begins to arrive at this level of existence? Who is left to care for their daily needs? Who is left to look after the elaborate technology which assures their survival? If we return to this man seated in his yoga position, we see that what finally disturbs him is the roof falling in. So in other words, the world around him starts to collapse, and this is what rouses him out of his comfortable position into action and into change, and the transition begins this transition into second tier. Graves says the roof can be called the A problems, the ecological crisis, the energy crisis, the population crisis, limits to growth, or any other such thing which is enough of a disturbance to awaken layer 6 man. And remember that Graves is writing this. I mean, he passed away in 86, so he's writing this decades and decades ago, but look at the insight that he had at that time. Graves said, naturally enough, his first reaction will be that evil technology is taking over, and all the good feeling and greenery which made the earth great is in the process of being wrecked forever. And isn't that a story that we hear a lot?
And of course, he's writing this, folks, in 1970s or so, yeah, or 80, early 80s.
Quite probably in the 70s, yeah. And Graves said, he's correct in the sense that his entire way of life, his level of existence, is indeed breaking down. It must break down in order to free energy for the jump into the A prime N prime state, and that was his labelling of layer 7, second tier, the first level of being. And so Graves classified the first 6 layers, 1 through 6, as subsistence layers, or subsistence ways of being human, and he classifies second tier as levels of being. So the focus has gone from how do I subsist, or how do I survive, which is a key driver in all the first 6 layers, to who am I being is now the driver. Survival is basically in the bag. We've sorted that out. I've got everything I need. Now, who am I? Who am I being? Yeah, so that's really interesting. And one more quote just from this section. These individuals do not, of course, see their striving for harmony with the human element as merely a stage that they're going through, but as the ultimate permanent goal of all life. So when they're in layer 6, it's kind of like, and this applies to all the layers, once you kind of crack it, it's like, okay, I've got it sorted. This is it. I've reached the pinnacle of human existence, and at layer 5, it's okay. Like I've got the 2-story house, on the country block of land, and my big boat, and
my share portfolio,
and my Aston Martin in the garage. This is it. I've done it. And you can go back through the layers, and every time, once we get over the big challenges, then we think we've reached the pinnacle of human existence. And yet, over time, problems develop and we realise, oh no, wait, there's other things to do. Yeah.
And of course, I guess at green, it becomes the first time that we're seeing the global problems emerge as be present in and able to be understood to some degree, or at least the information around them to be shared and seen globally, so that we actually, while we're sort of comfortable in that, sitting in that meditation position, many of us perhaps, the world is actually, as you alluded to, kind of falling around with the complex problems that exist now, and they can't be solved by just agreeing that they exist. We actually have to find a different way to take action to resolve them.
Yeah, and Grace also wrote that 6th level values are a great step forward for man. And remember that his work was sort of from the 50s through the 70s and early 80s, and so society hadn't quite moved into the kind of politically correct area of not referring to man or woman, but and so his writing sounds sexist to us, but it's just the era that he was writing from.
Yes.
He said they reflect the beginning of man's humanism, the demise of his animalism. And it's interesting, to think about that, because even with all of our sophisticated technology from the scientific industrial era, we're still killing each other in a very animalistic way.
And treating each other very unkindly reasons. And, for various reasons.
We are, and you've only got to look at the Australian government's treatment of refugees in the offshore detention camps to get a great example of that. And at the moment, they're trying to block medical attention for those people, which it's not human.
They must have suddenly one of the coalition members must have sort of lights lit up over their head and went, holy shit, we just lost the vote in Parliament for this Medivac thing, but wow, we can turn this to our advantage. Let's turn the fear level right up to 11, and pull back some of our lost constituents for the next election coming up soon.
That's right.
It's very sad.
Instinctively, they understand that there's this underlying fear of not surviving in the first tier. So fear is always a great motivator. Claire Graves wrote about the actual transition process between 6 and 7. And he said, my own thesis is that there will be an acceleration up to the time that it produces very horrendous problems. And by acceleration, he means an acceleration of change, an acceleration of the deterioration of our social systems, which were constructed according to layer 5 or previous.
Exponential change, which I think is what makes people feel very uncomfortable when that level of change is accelerating at that rate.
Yeah.
And becomes confusing, it becomes paradoxical, it becomes very difficult to get a hold of the truth.
That's
Fake
right.
news and everything else comes upon.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what actually is true and real.
And we're really living in this at the moment. Graves also said, when it produces problems of such a degree, things are going to have to slow down tremendously in order to deal with the resulting problems. The accumulation of unsolved problems is such that it's actually going to produce the most dramatic change in human behaviour that has yet occurred in all of man's history.
Yeah, huge.
So it's important to understand that there is no precedent for this shift from first tier to second tier. If there's anything that we can compare it to, the only thing might be our transition into being human, into layer 1 with the emergence of Homo sapiens from our predecessors. That kind of scale is the only thing that might come close to it, but actually it doesn't even come close to it, because the amount of coping capacity that's coming with second tier consciousness is just off the scale. So, and we'll get into that very shortly.
Indeed.
You're tuned to FutureSense with Nyck Jeanes and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up.
Yeah, tuned to FutureSense 1024, and coming up at 11 o'clock is Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond, and we are exploring second tier layer of consciousness of Claire W. Graves' work here on BFM.
So let's dive into it and talk about layer 7 and what it's like. And in the so one of the defining characteristics of layer 7 and the whole second tier of consciousness, as far as we know, is that it's primarily operating from a trans-rational way of being, whereas we've moved out of a rational way of being in layers 4, 5 and 6. And what that means is in layers 4, 5 and 6, the rational mind is king. Yeah. So we can be impacted by our pre-rational feelings, sensory perceptions, urges, instincts, which are our drivers at layers 1, 2, 3. But at 4, 5 and 6, the rational mind is laid over the top of that, and we can say, okay, well, I'm feeling really scared, but I know that I'm safe here because nothing's going to happen to me, therefore I'll go ahead and do this, yeah? And in the transition to second tier, we leave that rational mind and move beyond it, transcend it into the trans-rational. So when I say leave it, it's still there, but it's layered inside us now, and we have an extra and more capable layer in the trans-rational layer over the top of it. Yeah. And trans-rational is not rational. So in the shift between layer 6 and layer 7, we typically go through a very confusing time where we're not quite sure how we make decisions, because we've come from a place where the rational mind is our ultimate determinant, and that's not to say we always use the rational mind. Some people will still use the pre-rational, like, oh, that doesn't feel right, or I'm too scared, or whatever. But typically in 4, 5 and 6, it's the rational mind that says, okay, I have all the information now, and I figure out that, this is the choice that's best for me. And so in the transition space, we're leaving the rationality behind, and we're moving back to something that's not rational. So it often feels like we're going backwards to the pre-rational again, and in the early stages of the transition, that's typically what people do, is they start to go with their fears or their superstitions or anything that comes from the pre-rational layers. And that can be a very confusing time, because often those choices don't work out like they expected them to, but it's all perfect, and it's all part of building the evolutionary tension that's going to shift us further into second tier. And so once we start to really trap into the trans-rational, we're getting an awareness, we're getting knowledge and information that's not coming through the rational mind. So it's coming through accessing other dimensions of information, new dimensions that we didn't have access to before. It's very hard to describe this.
I guess intuition is the word that that goes closest to describing that.
Yeah, I sometimes call it a deep intuition. Yeah, and one of the places of confusion can be if we are having a fear response to a choice, then often we'll feel that in our gut, and people will say, I'm going to go with my gut here and choose this. And that sometimes, not always, but sometimes can be a feeling that is the result of trauma stored in the body, in the gut area, and that there's a big band across that gut area of the body where trauma is often stored, and that's part of the vagal nerve complex.
Because you can make a correlation with trauma, early childhood, and that pre-rational state of being that can appear to be intuition. Because that's what
right.
You're referring,
and it can be misinterpreted as this higher order transrational intuition, but it's actually not. And so there's a learning space there, and Ken Wilber calls this area that we have to pass through the pre-trans fallacy zone, pre as in pre-rational, trans as in transrational, fallacy zone, where we often mistake one for the other. But eventually we come out the other side of it, and it just emerges through practice. We keep practicing, we keep trying to tap into something that's not rational, and eventually through practice we get there into the transrational zone. And I often also call this quantum consciousness, because if you think about those experiments where they split a photon and so they have two particles and they're remotely located different parts of the planet, and
parts of the universe, for that matter,
connected through their spin, and then if the spin of one is changed, then the other one immediately responds, because there's a communication there that's not through the local domain. It's an interdimensional communication which seems to be beyond our sort of first tier awareness of space-time.
Another way of looking at that also is the notion of synchronicity, which Carl Jung pointed to at that time, because that moment of transrational awareness, quantum consciousness, is the recognition to a degree of synchronicity that may be occurring.
That's right, and a lot of Jung's work was done from layer 6, but in his later years he started to poke into second tier, and that, when he's talking about synchronicity, that was a symptom of that. So emerging into layer 7 is the first step into the second tier. So in some ways it's similar to layer 1 as the first step into first tier, or the first step into being human.
Baby steps.
It's a baby step, right? And if you look back now from where we are in the first tier of consciousness as a species, and you look at layer 1, it looks goddamn primitive, and it doesn't actually look much like being human, really. It's very animalistic in its appearance. That's the kind of hunter-gatherer existence. And so to mature second tier consciousness, layer 7 is going to look the same. Because what we do know is that there are certain patterns in how this all pans out, and the patterns seem to be consistent as far as we know. So layer 7's a baby step into second tier operation. It's later on, when our species has evolved further, we will look back at layer 7 and say, well, it's not really a good example of second tier, but it's certainly the first step into second tier. It's true to say, though, that it has more coping capacity in terms of its capacity to comprehend and deal with complexity than all of the first 6 layers combined. That's a little bit hard to get your head around, but if you think of all of the amazing leaps and bounds that humanity has made throughout history, like, leaping from living in a small plot of land in a local area to being able to travel great distances like Genghis Khan in the third layer and conquer whole societies, and then another leap into being able to sail around the entire world,
colonize half the world,
and colonize it, and figure out that it's actually a sphere and not a disc or anything that we're living on.
Big jump.
And then the jump to leave the planet and fly to the moon and back, that came with layer 5. And then the jump that we're, as a species, making, in terms of the global dominant paradigm right now, from the scientific industrial to the network-centric, cryptocurrency-driven, amazingly technically supported, network-centric, humanistic, values-driven way of living, which we're yet to see play out in full. And you add up all of those leaps and think that okay, this leap from 6 to 7 is all of that plus more, just to in between one stage and the next, which is mind-blowing. It literally is a quantum leap of consciousness.
So just take a breath, folks, because it is a lot, and I think for a lot of people's consciousness out there who are interested in this, it probably means that you're resonating in some way with it, but it is confusing, and it is a paradoxical, which is part of layer 7 too, the ability to handle, live with, to sit with paradox, and that's the thing. Some of the other elements that are really profound in here are not driven by fears or compulsions to the same degree. That's a very big one.
It is a very big one. And let me run through these key
Yes,
indicators now, as you're suggesting. So there's some key things that show up that somebody might be operating from second-tier consciousness. And the first one, as Nyck just said, is that fear is no longer a driver. So fear is a major driver in the first-tier layers. There's always a fear of something, whether it's a fear of not succeeding or a fear of not surviving or a fear of not being liked by your peers. There's always a fear. But from layer 7, once we get a solid foundation in it, that fear aspect of motivation dies down and goes away. So we're no longer motivated by fear. It doesn't mean that we don't feel fear. We can still feel fear. We don't become unfeeling. But sometimes when people who are still operating at the first tier layers talk about layer 7, they'll often see it as unfeeling because it doesn't have the same strong emotional responses that they do. It's simply because fear is not a motivator anymore, not a driver of behaviour.
Yeah, it can look sort of cold and sort of self-interested in some way, that kind of from that perspective that you're talking about.
It can, simply because it doesn't get tossed around by emotions in the way that people do.
And same with compulsions, which is another big thing, indulgences, compulsions, those idiosyncratic things that you may be continually falling into, whether it be maybe you think you're addicted to smoking or sexuality or love for that matter, or going down to your same cafe every single morning because that's where you feel safe. Any sort of thing that you see as a compulsion starts to drop away in this layer 7.
Yeah, so Graves also wrote that the compulsive behaviours, which are a characteristic of the first tier, are no longer there. And if we look at the key drivers of each layer in the first tier, we can figure out what the main compulsions are. The key layer for layer 6 is deep human connection. And so the compulsive behaviour is around wanting that deep human connection, and often that plays out practically as constant talking. I want to talk to you and I want to delve deep inside you so that you can do the same to me, so that we can connect deeply, and so let's keep talking.
And I guess that sort of well-known FOMO, fear of missing out, is part of that too. I've got to be there because everybody else is there. I should go there because that'll make me feel more of myself if I go to that thing there.
Exactly.
Have people there.
And another quick example would be layer 5. The key driver is personal success, and so the compulsive behaviours come around personal success. Sorry, I'm too busy. I have to keep working. Right? I've got to work harder and I've got to work faster because otherwise I'm not going to be successful. And we could go on. So absence of fear as a driver, an absence of compulsive behaviours, an absence of the rejection factor. So in the first tier of consciousness, when we move from one layer to the next layer, there's always a very strong rejection of the previous layer, but generally there's a rejection of all of the other layers because we're immersed in our layer. We feel like I've found the right way to live, and people who aren't living the way that I live, people who have different values, are wrong. They just haven't got it right.
Because look at the world that they've created before us and all the problems that we now have to live with and try and solve.
Exactly. So you'll hear people talking about different layers, different value sets as broken, wrong, misguided.
Diseased.
Diseased is another one. And that kind of language in describing other value sets disappears with second tier, because there's a general acceptance that each one of these layers has its place. We're in a nested system here, so you can't get rid of one of the layers. It just doesn't work. And of course, the capacity to do that comes from the fact that for the first time at layer 7, the layered arrangement of human value systems is visible. Whereas when we're in the first tier, we don't have any inherent capacity to sense that. When we bump into somebody who comes or is operating from a different set of values, we can feel that their values are not the same as us, but like I just said, we tend to make a moral judgment and say it's wrong, or I don't like it, or I just don't vibe with that person. But from layer 7, we develop this capacity to sense the frequencies of the different layers. And so I'm saying frequencies just to use the analogy of like radio frequencies associated with each of the different layers. And it's like skipping between radio stations as we go up the spiral of development. And so when we get to 7, we actually have the capacity to see and directly sense that, okay, gosh, I'm living in a world where people are all operating from different frequencies, and you realize that the frequencies are associated with these value sets. And so when you meet somebody who's coming from a particular value set, you can read their frequency, and you might not even notice that you do that. You know, if you've never come across a framework like Claire Graves's model to describe your personal experience, you might be just living the experience and knowing that, oh yeah, I get that. You know, I realize that when I meet a person like that, they're living life from that particular understanding, you know. So you don't necessarily have to have this theoretical framework behind you to live from second tier, certainly not. But that capacity to directly sense a frequency is a characteristic of second tier in general, and it means that we no longer act out this rejection factor. Okay,
so it's a deeper, in a sense, it's a deeper acceptance of different values then, isn't it? I mean, it's not just sort of what's politically correct or what appears to be true in a certain level, all of which is okay. It's actually a much deeper appreciation.
It is, you know, and it's more than just an acceptance, it's a visibility. It's really a visibility. You can actually see, not necessarily literally, some people can, but you can directly sense this. You know, it's not just a logical mind understanding; it's a direct sensing thing. And over time, for a second tier individual, as they get more comfortable and understand that process further, then they can read someone's frequency very, very quickly. And within moments of meeting somebody, they can read their frequency and therefore immediately understand what value set they're living life from, which makes it very easy to interact with people. You know, you're not stumbling and falling over things like in a clumsy way like you might do in the first tier. When you meet somebody with different values, you've got to kind of get onto a particular topic to realize that, oh hell, I'm talking to somebody here who really doesn't have my understanding or my value set around that.
Yeah.
So we've spoken so far about the absence of fear as a driver, the absence of compulsive behaviors, the absence of rejection around other value sets. Another characteristic of layer 7, this first step into second tier consciousness, is the capacity to understand and be comfortable with paradox. So the rational mind finds paradox very difficult because you're trying to figure out if it's this is not that, if it's this and not that, but it's actually this and that, which is very confusing.
I think I've always said, paradox is an indication of the language of the divine, so to speak, you're present with. That's my little take on that.
And I think it's definitely that, unless it's not.
Thank you.
And so, a rational, logical mind example of paradox would be, and this is just an analogy, it's not obviously the exact thing, but a child-proof lock, right, on a cupboard door, where, the child just knows that you pull doors to open them, and usually with child-proof locks, you can't pull the door by opening it. You've got to actually open it first and then push it back and flick a lever inside. And that, in a general sense, is a paradoxical situation for the child, and that's why the child can't cope with it, because it hasn't got that coping capacity. Paradox, an understanding and a comfort with paradox brings a capacity to deeply understand complex system dynamics and why a complex system might exhibit certain symptoms that are opposite to the actual way that the system is trending overall. And of course, there's no better example of that in current society than the climate that we often bang on about. So comfort with and capacity to work with paradox. And so you'll see second tier individuals taking these paradoxical steps, and that's often why they can seem kind of strange to folks who are looking at them from the first tier, because they seem to be doing stuff that looks like the opposite of what they ought to be doing, yet they're working in a paradoxical way with complex systems. And
the reason we're going to run out of time today to give a full exposition of all of this, but we'll come back to that. But for me, just to bring it down to the practical application, if you will, of this tier of thinking, because layer 7 is about systems of systems. So by being able to accept different values, by not being driven by previous fears or compulsions, by being able to recognize others and see where they're coming from, this enables the possibility of bringing the best of everything into a system and to adapt and to adopt it and to create new systems of systems that start to, which may not be the solutions that one thinks they're going to be. They're not going to be necessarily in the direction that you rationally think they should be. They may be completely different, but the ability to accept all sorts of different angles, so to speak, that can or may provide elements of solutions in a new system of systems.
Yeah, and often there's confusion about that topic when it's looked at from layer 6. Well, layer 6 is very focused on systems theory, so it likes to look at a whole system to include, you know, everything that it sees as appropriate or relevant in the system.
Like the Gaia hypothesis.
Yeah, whereas layer 7 is looking at systems of systems, and the obvious example in our discussion here is looking at the value systems, the layers of consciousness in the first tier, seeing them all and understanding that, wow, actually there's a whole system of systems here that I'm living within and I'm a part of it. And there's in the transition from 6 to 7, one of the things that trips people up is this difference between diversity within a single system and actually systems of systems. And there's a key distinction there. Just because you've got a lot of diversity doesn't necessarily mean that you're looking at a system of systems. So that's a key sort of understanding that emerges with second tier.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking FutureSense here on Bay FM.
10:48 here on FutureSense with Nyck and Steve, and a pregnancy, birth and beyond up at 11 o'clock. Stay tuned to Bay FM. We're concluding our little first expose of the yellow layer of layer 7 in Claire W. Graves' work.
Yeah, thanks, Nyck. So we just spoke about systems of systems, and some people call that systemic, a systemic approach. And this capacity that comes with the ability to read other people's frequencies, in other words, to directly sense which operating system or layer a person is operating from at the time, and remembering that this is a dynamic thing. So people are not locked into operating from one layer all the time. It's a dynamic process, and depending on clues that our life conditions give us, we will, in the first tier, subconsciously shift and move between layers to operate according to the complexity that's required by our life conditions. And what happens in second tier from layer 7 and onwards is that becomes a conscious process. So because we have this capacity to directly sense someone's operating frequency, we can then shift our frequency to match. And so yellow or layer 7 has what you might call a kind of shape-shifting adaptivity, capacity to meet somebody where they're at in the most amazing way, and to make the other person feel like you are actually doing that. You're meeting them right where they're at and you're matching their particular operating frequency in an exchange. So that's one of the things that makes layer 7 operation so capable. And remembering that in the progress through the layers, as we come up through the first tier, there's this alternation between left brain and right brain, which gives rise to individually oriented values and then alternatively community oriented values. And we swing backwards and forwards between those as we progress up the spiral. And then into second tier, layer 7 does have an individual theme to it, but it's much less extreme than in the first tier, because what's happening is we're getting for the first time an integrated operation between left brain and right brain in a way that hasn't happened before. And I think we still don't have a lot of good science around that, but we understand that we're no longer biased one way or the other way in so much as we were in the first tier. That reduces, and we're able to operate and switch between left brain and right brain much more easily, which is part of where this quantum leap in capacity comes from. The other thing that happens is that our entanglement with the issues of the first layer falls away significantly. So as we go through the first tier of consciousness, what happens is that we're building a stack of operating systems, and each one has this entanglement with certain aspects of our life. So the first layer has entanglement with our survival issues, the second layer with our family issues, the third layer with our power issues, the fourth layer with our duty based issues, the fifth layer with our issues of success, the sixth layer with our issues of acceptance within our peer group. And so by layer 6, we've got a whole collection of these things, each with its own compulsive behavior. And so we become very overloaded by the time we reach layer 6 with all of these competing capacities and liabilities, getting torn around by, okay, I really like to do that, but I'm torn by my family, or I really feel like I want to do that, but I'm torn by my religious beliefs. And these That's things, great. This fills up our psychological capacity. And as we transition into second tier, for some reason we become disentangled from all of that, and it falls away, and we can still access all of those capacities, we can still access all of those experiences, and we can still live according to those previous layers, but they no longer dominate our behavior.
You don't have to lose anything, but you're not driven by it in the same way.
Exactly. And so the extra coping capacity that we get in second tier comes from the fact that all of that stuff just dies down, and it leaves us with this big space that we can play around in terms of our psychological capacity. Another thing that we find emerging with layer 7 is the ability for pattern recognition. And again, I think this comes from this fact that we can start to see systems of systems. So pattern recognition capacity really climbs up. So I know we're tight for time and we're almost done. There's just a couple more things that I want to mention here before we close up. So each layer has a theme, and in Claire Graves's model, the theme of the 7th layer, yellow, first step into the second tier, is I learn. And it's I learn because all of a sudden we're experiencing life through effectively new eyes. We're experiencing life in a place of being able to sense dimensions of existence that we just couldn't sense before. And so you could liken that to the experience of Neo in the Matrix movie, where he's kind of pulled out of what could be the first tier of consciousness, pulled out of the Matrix, and then he goes back in and he sees it with new eyes, like he experiences it like he's never seen it before, and he literally sees the code. Right?
I mean, that's an incredible example in recent pop culture.
It is.
This film, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
Because it's resonating with a lot of people for reasons that they probably don't even know in most cases.
It's an amazing analogy. It really is. And our way of operating now from layer 7 is we look for what works. So we have all of this access to extra information. We can shift and move between operating frequencies, and we start to learn that these value systems, this band of frequencies, is like our artist's palette. We've got all of these options available, all of these different colors, and we can shift our own frequency to meet other people's frequency. We can approach problems from whatever level of coping capacity is most appropriate for them. So if we've got a success-oriented business issue, then it's probably best approached from layer 5 and that kind of thinking and that frequency. And we can shift ourselves to do that. And so this is where the extra capacity comes from, is we're no longer locked into a single frequency, a single way of thinking, a single set of values. We have access to a whole range, everything that humanity has developed ever since it first emerged. And we can apply whatever systems, whatever value systems, whatever frequencies are most appropriate for the complexity of the problem at hand.
Exciting times, folks. And thanks for the couple of texts that came in. And someone has asked about the title and author of the 200-page or so book that we mentioned before that Steve has. And it's Claire W. Graves, His Life and His Work. And it's by Rainer Krumm, that's Krumm, and Benedict Pastorfer, Pastorfer. We'll post these on our Twitter feed.
And on Facebook.
And on Facebook, our Facebook site, FutureSense, and our Twitter feed at FutureSense Show.
And this is a brand new book. It was only published last year.
You can order that. Thanks for joining us here today. And the podcast will be up in a few days of this show, minus sponsorships and announcements and even the music, which is a bit of a shame sometimes. But you can always check out the full show on the Bay FM website also, if you want to check out what sort of music we have played today, if any of that interests you. And we will be with you next Monday morning from 9 to 11. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Nick.
Great pleasure.
Yeah, it's been good.
You've been listening to FutureSense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. FutureSense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.